George Harrison truly hated him more than anyone. He was known as the Quiet One, the spiritual soul of the Beatles. While Lennon and McCartney soaked up the spotlight, George Harrison quietly forged his own identity within the band and within himself. But behind that calm, contemplative demeanor simmered something far deeper than most fans ever suspected, a slow-burning resentment aimed squarely at one man. So who was the true object of George's hidden fury? A bandmate who stole the limelight? A manager who pulled the strings? Or someone even more unexpected? Today, we peel back the curtain on what may be the most complicated and perhaps most surprising relationship in Beatles history. And with the Beatles still making headlines in 2025, winning a Grammy for their AI-assisted farewell single now and then more than 5 decades after their breakup, understanding George Harrison's inner life feels more urgent than ever. Because behind the music, the meditation, and the massive fame lies a grudge that could forever change the way you view the Fab Four. Early life. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, at 12, Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool, the youngest of 4 children born to Harold and Louise Harrison. Harold worked as a bus conductor, while Louise was of Irish Catholic descent and worked as a shop assistant. What set Louise apart, though, was her fierce devotion to her children's happiness and an almost mystical love for music. During her pregnancy with George, she regularly tuned into Radio India broadcasts, drawn to the mysterious sounds of sitars and tablas. As biographer Joshua Green noted, she hoped that exotic music would bring peace and calm to the baby in the womb. In many ways, it worked. George Harrison would grow up to carry Indian classical music into the Western mainstream like no artist before him. The family later moved to a council house in Speke, where George enrolled at Dovedale Primary School. He eventually attended Liverpool Institute High School for Boys, where he was famously disengaged from academics but deeply captivated by guitars, doodling them in his notebooks and declaring, "I was totally into guitars." It was in early 1956 that everything shifted. While riding his bicycle through Liverpool, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel drifting from a nearby house, and rock and roll grabbed him by the collar and never let go. His mother purchased him a guitar for £3.10, and from that moment, there was no looking back. Early career. Around the age of 14, George formed a skiffle group with his brother Peter called the Rebels. It was on a Liverpool bus riding to school that he first encountered Paul McCartney. That casual bus ride would become one of the most consequential meetings in music history. In March 1958, George auditioned for John Lennon and Paul McCartney's skiffle group, the Quarrymen, at Rory Storm's Morgue Skiffle Club. Lennon initially felt Harrison, just 15 at the time, was too young to join. But McCartney arranged a second audition on a Liverpool bus, and George silenced all doubts by flawlessly playing the lead guitar part for Raunchy. He was in. By 1960, the band, soon to become the Beatles, secured residencies at Hamburg clubs, honing their raw talent into something formidable. George was deported mid-tour for being underage, but that barely slowed him down. By December 1961, Brian Epstein had taken over management, and their debut single Love Me Do reached number 17 on the charts. The following year, Beatlemania erupted across the globe. George Harrison, press-dubbed the Quiet Beatle, was at the center of it all, yet somehow always slightly to the side of it. Musically, George began asserting himself from the start. He had lead vocal credits on their debut album and earned his first solo writing credit with Don't Bother Me on with the Beatles in 1963. He became the band's scout for American soul music, and by Rubber Soul in 1965, he was already steering the group toward folk rock and Indian classical sounds. His use of the sitar on Norwegian Wood was groundbreaking, a respectful and revolutionary introduction of Eastern sounds to Western pop. By Revolver in 1966, he opened the entire album with the blistering Taxman, showcasing that George Harrison was no longer content being a passenger. The complicated heart of the Beatles. The relationship between George Harrison and Paul McCartney was layered from the very beginning. They were, in many ways, the closest two Beatles schoolboys from Liverpool who bonded on the bus before John Lennon was ever in the picture. McCartney has called Harrison his baby brother, and when George married Pattie Boyd in January 1966, Paul was his best man, the only other Beatle even present at the ceremony. But familiarity bred friction. As the Beatles grew more sophisticated, particularly with the Sgt. Pepper's era, McCartney's controlling tendencies began to suffocate George's creative spirit. The album, widely celebrated as a masterpiece, was driven almost entirely by McCartney's vision. Harrison later admitted he had mixed feelings about it, calling it both a milestone and a burden. His own composition on the record, Within You Without You, stood apart from everything else, beautiful, meditative, and pointedly un-McCartney. By the time of the White Album in 1968 and Let It Be in 1969, the tension had boiled over. Harrison quit the band outright on January 10, 1969, walking out of the Twickenham studio sessions after a particularly bruising argument. He returned 12 days later when the band agreed to move filming to Apple Studio and dropped the idea of returning to live performance, but the damage was done. The wounds were real, and they didn't fully heal. George and McCartney, the feud. Harrison's frustration with McCartney was multidimensional. It wasn't merely personal, it was professional, creative, and deeply psychological. Despite contributing iconic compositions like Something, Here Comes the Sun, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, George was typically limited to just 2 or 3 songs per Beatles album. Pattie Boyd described the atmosphere plainly. George saw Paul as difficult. They would tolerate each other, but I think George basically didn't like Paul's personality. Boyd said Harrison had returned from India in a state of inner peace, and McCartney's domineering energy was simply incompatible with that. In a 1974 interview quoted in Ashley Cahn's George Harrison on George Harrison, Harrison was blunt: "I would rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney. Paul is a fine bass player, but he's a bit overpowering at times. I would join a band with John Lennon any day, but I could not join a band with Paul McCartney." He was quick to add that it wasn't personal, but of course, it was personal. It was all personal. The recording of Maxwell's Silver Hammer became a particular flashpoint. George recalled McCartney drilling the band relentlessly on what he felt was a fruity and overindulgent song while his own compositions waited for scraps of studio time and enthusiasm. McCartney's perfectionism, which had fueled so much of the Beatles' brilliance, became a source of genuine resentment for Harrison. In a 1974 BBC radio interview, George said something remarkable: "McCartney ruined me as a guitar player." It was a stunning admission, one that revealed just how deeply the dynamic had cut. When asked in a 2020 interview with Howard Stern whether he had underestimated Harrison's songwriting, McCartney acknowledged it plainly: "It was easy to underestimate George because me and John had always written most of the stuff." George was a late bloomer as far as writing was concerned. He wasn't that interested in the beginning, but then he started to get interested and, boy, did he bloom. He wrote some of the greatest songs ever. It was an honest and generous tribute, but it arrived decades too late to matter to George. Despite this, something always held them together. Harrison himself acknowledged it in a 1974 BBC interview: "I just know that whatever we've been through, there's always been something that's tied us together." In February 1994, the surviving Beatles, McCartney, Harrison, and Ringo Starr reunited as the so-called Threedles to work on Lennon demos, even though tensions between Harrison and McCartney persisted through the sessions. And it was George who reportedly pushed McCartney to reconcile with Yoko Ono, telling him, "You don't want to carry that stuff around your whole life." Even in his frustration with Paul, George was the one counseling piece. Their final meetings, as Harrison's health deteriorated in 2001, were described as tearful but warm. McCartney later recalled sitting with Harrison just 10 days before his death. "We joked about things, just amusing, nutty stuff. He was my baby brother, almost. We held hands." George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58, after a long battle with cancer. The man he truly hated. Here is where the story takes its most revealing turn. While the world fixated on the McCartney friction, a deeper, colder estrangement was quietly festering, and it pointed directly at John Lennon. From the beginning, George had looked up to John. Lennon was the one with the sideburns and the swagger, the terrifying wit, the artistic daring. George's admiration was real. But Lennon's treatment of Harrison over the years had a corrosive quality that McCartney's bossiness never quite matched. Where McCartney was domineering, Lennon could be dismissive, and that dismissal cut far deeper. Lennon frequently belittled Harrison's spiritual journey, mocking his devotion to Indian music, meditation, and Eastern philosophy. For George, who had found his truest self through those pursuits, that ridicule was not just rude, it was a kind of erasure. During the Let It Be sessions, it was actually Lennon, not McCartney, who George reportedly had a physical altercation with. Their problems intertwined business and personal resentment in ways that were harder to untangle than any creative dispute. When the Beatles finally dissolved and Harrison published his memoir I, Me, Mine, the omission that stung most publicly was not of McCartney, it was of Lennon. John responded with fury, telling Playboy, "By glaring omission in the book, my influence on his life is absolutely zilch and nil. Not mentioned." He was right. George barely mentioned him at all, and in the language of rock and roll memoirs, silence is the loudest condemnation. Harrison later admitted in interviews that Lennon could be self-centered and emotionally difficult. He mourned John's death in 1980, as one mourns the loss of someone complicated and irreplaceable. But he never sugarcoated the emotional distance and wounds that had accumulated between them over a lifetime. Behind the peace signs and the sitar strings, George Harrison carried a grudge that never fully healed, and it was aimed, with quiet but unmistakable precision, at John Lennon. Harrison's legacy. George Harrison was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist in 2004. He received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2009, in a ceremony attended by Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Jeff Lynne, and Tom Petty, with his son Donnie chanting the Hare Krishna mantra. Martin Scorsese's documentary George Harrison, Living in the Material World, released in 2011, brought his extraordinary life to a new generation of fans. And in early 2025, the Beatles made history yet again, winning Best Rock Performance at the Grammy Awards for Now and Then, their AI-assisted farewell single, earning the honor 61 years after their first Grammy win. The song was completed by Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr using guitar tracks recorded by George Harrison during the 1995 anthology sessions, with John Lennon's voice extracted from an original demo using AI technology developed for Peter Jackson's documentary. George was there, in his way. His guitar ringing out across decades, still weaving itself into the fabric of their story. Even in death, he remained essential. Hit channel Wikipedia. Sean Ono Lennon, accepting the award, told the crowd, "Play the Beatles' music to your kids. The world can't afford to forget about them. We need this music, we need peace and love." It was a sentiment George Harrison lived by, even if finding that peace within the band that made him famous proved to be the hardest work of his life. CNN. What do you think about George Harrison's complicated relationships with his bandmates? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video compelling, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind the music.